jump in. And we're recording this. You can tell your friends in case they are at the other meeting and want to listen to it. Again, welcome. And our agenda for today is going to be first going through a legislative update, because there are a lot of bills that have been proposed that touch on our gas leaks issue. We're going to do that and then move into an update with on a the GeoGrid pilots that have been approved, and an update on the 2080 stakeholder process that's going on with the DPUs, consultants, and the utilities. Then our main feature is going to be a hydrogen presentation by Sarah Griffith and Kathy Christopherson about hydrogen as a possible fuel source. And then we hope we'll have a good 15 minutes for questions and discussion and do wrap up and next meeting. I do want to say that many of you may know that there's a competing meeting right now. This 2080 DPU and gas utility stakeholder process announced an extra meeting for this exact time. So it's starting right now as well. And so Brooks from MAPC and Audrey from HEAT are not going to be able to be here. But we're going to have Leah presenting Audrey's HEAT slides from HEAT. Finally, I want to say that the tentative date for the next webinar on hydrogen will be March 2nd, and it will be sponsored by us, but it will include National Grid personnel being here talking about their approach to hydrogen. We thought it would be best to first have non-utility perspective on this issue, and then at a separate meeting hear from NGrid on the same topic, and we can hopefully have a good discussion. If there are no questions, Leah, we can jump into the legislative update.
Awesome. Okay. Brooke, should I start sharing my screen?
Yes. And
wonderful.
Leah, before you jump in, hello, Dominic Nicholas from HEAT. Thanks for joining. Do you want to give the update about the pilot with National Grid, or do you want us to do that for you? I just saw that you're here, and we're so glad
you go
you are.
ahead. I'm
okay.
Ill prepared. Sorry, you've already prepared something.
Okay. Yep. Perfect. All right. Take it away, Leah. Yeah.
Awesome.
All
I am fighting with Zoom right now. 2 seconds. We're gonna get there. You would think after how many Zooms I've had today, it would be fine. All right. Can you see it as a slideshow now?
Yes.
Great.
That's
okay.
Great.
So I'm going to talk a little bit about where we are in the legislative session to sort of put us in our 2-year cycle, and then there are a couple bills that we're going to go through and sort of check in on the status of where they're at, and then open to any questions that folks may have. So the legislative cycle, as we've talked about before in this group or on this table, is 2 years long, and we are in year 2. We started year 2 in January, and one of the requirements is that all of the committees here have a public hearing on the bills that they receive to consider, and then based on a joint rule that both branches adopted, the first Wednesday of February of the second year, they have to report out on those bills or ask for more time to continue reviewing them. So we're at this beautiful moment where I've been refreshing my computer all morning to see if there's more news on where these bills stand, because we're expecting them to make decisions on what happens to them next. So all of this information is very likely to change in the next 48 hours, but we'll give a status update of where it stands. And then the legislature is going to be continuing to hold formal sessions through the end of July. That's when we expect them to take up most major bills for the session. And then they'll go into informal sessions from July until the new session starts in January. And that glad to talk more about how that came to be. It was a bit more legislative history. But on to the very exciting bill updates. So Future of Heat, we've talked about a bunch around this coalition table filed by Senator Cream and Rep. Ehrlich, now former Rep. Ehrlich, and Rep. Minimucci. And this is the bill that reduces the risk of current gas system and supports a just transition and financing and jobs. And there's a fact sheet from Gas Leaks Allies that I can also make available. And where's the bill now? It continues to be in the Joint Committee on Telecom, Utilities, and Energy. There was a public hearing at the beginning of November that a number of folks on this call testified at. There was a lot of public hearing. It was one of the longer hearings that has happened for the session. So kudos to everyone here for helping raise the issue. Another bill we've talked about is gas safety, the act relative to eliminating gas leaks. This is a bill that really focuses on empowering municipalities and prioritizing safety and gas leak repair. Again, fact sheet is available that we can provide in the chat as well. And this bill also is in the Joint Committee on Telecom, Utilities, and Energy. They're still reviewing it. This also had a hearing back at the beginning of November, that same hearing as the Future of Heat. So a lot of folks testified on both bills, I think. So that was great. The third bill, municipal reforestation. This is a bill that requires municipalities to develop a reforestation plan, talks about some funding pieces, and also provides oversight within EEA. So this is really talking about what happens to those trees that are impacted by gas leaks, and how do we think about reforestation as a community, right? What are we going to do for our trees? This bill is in the Joint Committee on Environment, Natural Resources, and Agriculture, and it had a hearing on December 7th. There have been very few bills reported out so far from the Environment and Natural Resources Committee. I expect that we will see a lot more updates in the coming days. The Telecom, Utilities, and Energy Committee, on the other hand, has reported a handful of bills. So we're getting there with both of these committees. So those are three we've talked a lot about. And then this is one I don't think we've talked about a lot around this table, but local option legislation. A number of communities filed their legislation to ask for their own ability to permit to require all electric buildings and homes going forward as of a certain date. I think I have on my list, and folks here can definitely correct me if I'm wrong, Arlington, Lexington, Concord, Brookline, Acton, probably a few more have filed those local ordinances. And then there was also a bill filed by Senator Eldridge and Representative Gouveia that would create a system in the state that communities wouldn't have to ask each time the legislature, wouldn't have to ask the legislature for the ability to adopt these provisions. They would just be allowed to adopt it. So it would authorize municipalities to require new building permit applications submitted after January 1 of this year to be all electric and prohibit on-site fuel infrastructure. There were some limited exemptions, and then it set out a process for how municipalities would be able to comply. The hearing was held earlier this summer in the Joint Committee on Municipalities, and then what often happens, the House bill and the Senate bill go in different directions. So the House bill was reported on for further consideration by the Joint Committee on Telecom, Utilities, and Energy, and that's where that bill is under further review. And then the Senate bill was favorably reported to the Senate Committee on Ways and Means, where it is being considered. That is really exciting to have it be reported favorably and have it be in Ways and Means for further conversation with that staff. That means it is one step closer to being taken up by the Senate for further discussion. So that's my germ of good news in terms of bills moving that we know already, even before Joint Rule 10. So that's my update that I have. I'm going to stop the screen share in case folks have questions that we can talk through.
Leah?
Yeah.
I have just one thing to add, and it's a very new bill introduced last week by Rep. Kay Khan from Newton. I think she's from Newton.
Yep.
And it's HD 4755, and it goes even beyond that local option Eldridge Gouveia bill and says that starting in January 2023, all buildings in Massachusetts must be built all new construction and major renovations above 50% need to be built electric. So it's really, really far reaching.
Yeah.
Oh,
That's super exciting.
Yeah, and I guess the speaker supports it. And who knows how far it'll get. I'm sure there'll be major opposition, but it does all these show what energy there is and focus there is on decarbonization.
Great. Thanks, Anne.
So, other ads or questions?
Great.
Okay, Judith asked that I put that new bill number in the chat. I will do.
Awesome.
Oh, Dom did. Thank you, Dom.
Great. Okay, well then I'm gonna resume sharing my screen and keep us moving to the presentation on heat. Let's see if, can you see my screen again?
Yes.
Yes.
Wonderful. Okay. And bear with me as I'm reading notes off of another screen. I swear I'm paying attention to all of your faces. So heat's geogrid. We've talked about this issue before, and Dominic, please correct me in the chat or out loud if I say anything incorrectly. It's a street segment network of ground source heat pumps, right? And like the gas system, the infrastructure is would be in the street with service lines going to each individual building. There'd be boreholes attached going down just a few hundred feet. And then the pipelines would be filled with plain water. The heat pumps in each building would then pull off the heat or cooling that the building needs from that water. And all the components are readily American made. Gas utilities have the customers, the right of way in the street, the expertise in pumping thermal energy through the pipes under the ground, and financing methods to spread the cost of this infrastructure across. It would be a non-intermittent renewable. It doesn't take up new land because it's already installed in the street, right? So this is sort of a encapsulation of a lot of what we've talked about before around GeoGrid. And then there've been a number of case studies around the country. This one is a picture of Colorado, Mesa University, where there are 4 systems interconnected that serve 1 million square feet of buildings. And they're gas backup boilers intended to restore the temperature of the water in the loop if it gets cold. Hasn't need to be fired in 12 years. So that's pretty exciting stuff. So where are we in Massachusetts? Well, we're in New England in general, right? Initial installations of $45 million have been committed. So in Massachusetts, Eversource, Merrimack Valley, National Grid all have some commitments. In New York, really exciting, on Earth Day, Mayor de Blasio last year announced potential legislation that would allow future installations to scale. And then there's just a lot of interest nationally on this topic. So moving even more close to home, DPU has approved National Grid to install 4 demonstration projects. You see that up at the top of the screen. In the buildings attached, the gas appliances would be replaced with electric appliances. And there's money that's set aside, 15.6 million, that would cover this. And the installations would be in the gas grid territory. And then the priorities for site selection are included in the slide, right? Gas constraints, leak prone aging infrastructure, low or moderate income residents in each community. No one site is going to be expected to have all of these features, but a combination, I think, is sought. So that's something to really keep in mind, is that we've got this potential for 4 installations in the National Grid gas territory. And then there's also research being funded. In the ARPA bill that the legislature passed just a few months ago, there was funding set aside, and you see that sort of listed, the language on the left, very legalese, but there's $5 million set aside that would fund a GeoGrid research team to do some of this work. And you see the aspects of their work listed on the right. evaluate installations, model technology, monitor energy storage, public data bank, right? There's a lot of those pieces that we've talked about that would help build the case for more of this infrastructure. And we'd be able to study that and have real data to back up what might happen next. So what's next? The all-important slide. Please contact National Grid if there are sites that you would like to suggest to be part of this pilot, one of those 4 locations. And then HEAT is having a charrette coming up soon in April or May, and you should contact Carrie if your community is interested in participating. And this is really talking about how towns that can't possibly have their own geogrid through the utility, and really like having that conversation about what you would get to do as a community to go next. So that's what I have on what's happening with all things geogrid. So I'm going to stop my share and see if there are any questions. And chances are I probably won't be able to answer them, but I will take them down diligently and report them back, and hopefully get some answers by email for folks. Dave asked, will any of the installations reuse existing gas piping? My understanding is that that would definitely be a priority. I'm looking to Anne and Dom. Great, okay.
I've heard that that can't always happen.
Yep.
But yeah, I don't know.
We'll find out.
Any other questions? Okay. Thank you, Leah.
Oh, yes. And thank you, Laura, for putting in that Framingham is going to be getting one of the geothermal pilots in Eversource's territory. So that's the other piece is, right, National Grid has their pilots, Eversource has theirs. So we're going to be getting a lot of different data, and they're testing for different things, which I think will be really exciting. So we'll have lots of different data to pull from.
So there's a question in the chat about cost per house. I'll just say my understanding is that these pilots won't involve individual cost, like individual households won't be required to pay anything, right? I mean, that's the whole idea of the demonstration project, but it's a really good question. I don't know what the estimated costs are going forward.
Well, and there for utility costs, there's a fixed level of payment for low-income people.
Yeah, I'll bring that question back and I'll get an answer. This is really helpful.
Thank you, Tom, for that question.
Yeah.
So can I move us along to our next piece?
Yep.
All right. So my name's Lisa Olney. I'm on the Wellesley Select Board. I'm on the coordinating team of the Multi-Town Gas Leaks Initiative. And you may be wondering why the Multi-Town Gas Leaks Initiative is talking about hydrogen, and really touched on that in her introduction. We've invited National Grid to come talk with us about their plans for hydrogen in March, and we really wanted to make sure we were ready for that conversation with more information and sort of a baseline understanding of some of the issues, and that we're ready to ask some good questions. So like us, you've probably been hearing about hydrogen as a potential fuel replacement for natural gas. And the utility companies and others are really promoting this idea that hydrogen can take the place of natural gas or be blended with it and piped through the existing pipe distribution system. And that idea is really being considered very seriously here in Massachusetts. It's part of the conversations in the DPU 2080 stakeholder process. And we just think it's important for us all to understand what's being proposed, what actually makes sense, and what the issues or considerations are for those of us here on the ground in municipalities. So we're very excited to have Sarah Griffith and Kathy Christofferson here to give us an introduction to the topic. Sarah has over 10 years experience communicating with utilities and 20 years of experience working for and volunteering with environmental organizations. She was among the first groups trained in 2007 as part of the Climate Reality Project. She's volunteered with Gas Leaks Allies for the past 3 years and was an author of Rolling the Dice on gas safety. and has coordinated the Gas Leaks Allies Hydrogen and Renewable Natural Gas Working Group for a little over a year. Kathy is the co-founder of the Pipeline Awareness Network for the Northeast, fighting fossil fuel infrastructure expansion, and she's their representative on the Mass Power Forward Planning team. She's also the Conservation Commissioner and Tree Warden for the town of Ashby. So I'm going to turn it over to Sarah. And Sarah, you're going to share your screen.
Yeah, thank you, Lisa. Hang on a second while I get through this. Oops. Okay, can you see the slide?
Yes, we
Hear me?
can.
Oh, great. Okay, well, thank you for that introduction, Lisa. That was great. A year ago, I had just started learning about hydrogen. So I started from ground zero with sort of knowing where it was on the periodic table, and that was it. So the gas companies that heat our homes present hydrogen and renewable natural gas as a rainbow of hope for solving our climate problems. And we'll take a look at the facts and policy issues shaping hydrogen and RNG for home heating in Massachusetts. So most of you are familiar with the pressure climate change is placing on both the state and on gas utilities. As a result, the state has looked across each energy sector for opportunities to eliminate fossil fuels. It's passed legislation and regulations to cut emissions. So there are two sectors that use gas: heating buildings and generating electricity. Electric generation is on track to switch to cleaner sources: solar, wind, hydropower, and energy efficiency. On buildings, the state recognizes that the combustion of natural gas is the largest end-use contributor of emissions in the building sector, but there's not a clear path forward. There's pressure from the state government on gas companies to change how we heat. Utilities are also facing business pressures. So despite climate change under state law, LDCs or local distribution companies can't deliver anything but gas. Their business model is dependent on constant infrastructure investment and on which they earn returns. And Dr. Seavey, who I know has spoken to you recently, referred to the ongoing investment as the largest, most expensive infrastructure project ever undertaken in the Commonwealth. And we still have just as many leaks as we ever have. So with no reduction in the amount of methane emitted from leaks, we're not able to meet our climate goals. So gas companies know that piping gas into homes and businesses, which once looked like a low risk, highly profitable business, is looking pretty shaky these days. But what if they could keep their current business model, their investment in infrastructure, and just pipe clean fuels? Hydrogen and renewable natural gas seem like good candidates. Hydrogen makes water when it's burned, and RNG is methane extracted from landfill and waste biogas, gas that would otherwise just escape into the atmosphere. So what we're going to do today is test this idea. We're all going to put ourselves in the role of commissioners and look at their criteria to assess whether piping RNG and hydrogen to burn in people's homes is a good idea. So affordability, reliability, emissions reductions, safety and security and equity are the values that the DPU is supposed to be using. I'm not expert enough on security to speak to that, but I will speak to the other 5. I'm also going to add in one value that I think is important to all of us, and that's public health. So we'll talk a little bit about that at the end before we get to Kathy's slides. So hydrogen and RNG can both play a role in our future. They're not 100% bad. Hydrogen's a lightweight and long-term storage solution. It can power fuel cell vehicles for long-haul transportation. Converted to ammonia or methanol, it can move container ships across the ocean much more cleanly than the bunker fuel they use now. And it can be made on site to address hard to decarbonize industrial processes. Likewise, biogas should be captured on site and used locally, just as we currently do on Deer Island. But let's look at it for piping into our homes. The first value is affordability. Hydrogen is an energy carrier, meaning hydrogen doesn't exist by itself in nature. We have to separate it from other molecules through a manufacturing process. So what that means is that it's always going to cost more than the fuel that we use to make it from. It's a commodity with a price that fluctuates constantly. So you can see that I'm showing ranges here of costs. We can make educated guesses based on the already large hydrogen industry in the US. So gray hydrogen is made from methane, and it's the lowest cost, and it's also 95% of all the hydrogen that's currently manufactured. Blue hydrogen adds on a process to try to capture some of the CO2, so it's more expensive. And finally, green hydrogen, which doesn't really exist yet. There's no commercial manufacturers of green hydrogen, is the most expensive. Lazard is an economics think tank, and they're predicting a range for green hydrogen 5 to 10 times as much as fossil gas. So these prices are all speculative. I don't want to be held to them, but hydrogen will never cost less than fossil gas. The utilities are through the 2080 proceeding. We've heard that they're going to pipe green hydrogen from onshore wind in Pennsylvania. And by the way, those wind turbines don't exist in Pennsylvania yet. But we used this, the pricing from Statista of 0.039 cents per kilowatt hour to make green hydrogen, the lowest cost green input for green hydrogen. So that would make green hydrogen cost $6.55 per therm. And after 5 years of production, as economies of scale start to take place, it could go down to $5.35 per therm. So think about your current heating bill and how many therms you use and what that might cost. Utilities are also promoting renewable natural gas made from trees or trash. RNG is very expensive, 4 to 17 times as much as fossil gas. Plus, it can only replace 13% of our current demand. I'm going to go to a different way to think about affordability now, and that's comparing it to electrification and figuring out what people's choices are. So let's say you have 100 units of hydrogen and you burn it in a hydrogen boiler. That gives you 46 units of energy output in the form of heat. If you take that same amount of energy in the form of electricity and use it to run an air source heat pump, you get nearly 6 times the amount of energy out. So heating and cooling with a heat pump is more efficient and more cost effective. A ground source heat pump is even more efficient than an air source heat pump. The customers will be required to replace gas heating equipment and gas appliances, whether or not we use hydrogen, network geothermal, or electrification. And that's appliances are a huge area for further exploration, and it's a complicated area. So we could spend a lot of time talking about that, but we'll skip over it for now. When you make hydrogen from electricity or from methane, you lose about 30% of the energy value, meaning you need 30% more of your input to get the same amount of energy. This is for steam methane reforming. A switch to hydrogen would require tens of billions invested in infrastructure. We have to replace all the bare steel and cast iron pipe because hydrogen corrodes metal and also leaks at around twice the rate of methane. City gate meters can't measure hydrogen currently, so we'd replace all of those. At a 20% hydrogen blend, you've only replaced 7% of the energy value. So you have to triple the pressure to get the same energy content you had before. And then there's the cost of appliance and system replacement. And since hydrogen does not stay mixed with methane, we would need to add blending mechanisms. And just the volume, we'd have to burn and use so much more to get the same amount of energy. So we can say that hydrogen has a surcharge attached to it. So what are the implications of all these numbers? This kind of helps us place burning hydrogen for heat in space. It's a graphic by Michael Liebrecht, who's part of the Hydrogen Science Coalition. He places domestic heating down at the bottom, meaning that it's very nearly unaffordable. We're we're facing high climate impacts that are also costing us billions. So one consideration about affordability, or when we're looking at solutions, is we need to ask which one will slow flooding, lower extreme precipitation, and reduce the number of 90-degree-plus days. An investment that avoids some degree of climate catastrophe is more attractive than one that doesn't. So I'll leave you with those thoughts about affordability. We're going to turn to reliability now. The first notion is islanding, a concept some of you are probably familiar with. We currently have a single branching tree system. This is a map of National Grid pipes in Boston and parts of the South Shore. The result of this design is vulnerability to black swan events, such as the one we saw in the Merrimack Valley, and to cascading outages in areas downstream from a break in the system. This time, about 4 years ago, Quidneck lost all of their heating for 2 weeks due to a break in the system in the winter. We have an opportunity to rethink this design if we move to a solution like network geothermal or microgrids for electricity. We can require the energy systems we're building to island, or we can continue to pipe combustible gases with the same vulnerability to cascading outages and disasters. The DPU also, along the lines of reliability, looks for consistent availability of fuels when they assess utility plans. So how can we predict whether we'll have enough green hydrogen? So Wood Mackenzie came up with this graph to predict how much green hydrogen we'd have globally over the next few years. So you can see they're predicting multiplication by around 12 to get to where we would be in 2025. But how much hydrogen will we need just in Massachusetts in that same time period? So we'd have to, completely jumpstart an entirely new industry to even get to a 10% blend. So and that's lower than what the utilities are proposing. All right, so what would this look like? How much wind power would we need? For a 10% fracked gas replacement, onshore, we'd need 1,430 wind turbines, or one every 7 square miles, just for heating, not to support the electric grid, just for heating. Offshore, we would need 715 windmills in addition to those that we'd need for our electric grid. So let me ask you, while all of these windmills are getting built and installed close to electrolyzers and water sources, will the utilities deliver gray hydrogen made from fossil fuels? Now we'll talk about emissions reduction a little bit. The starting point for cutting emissions is the regular measurement of actual atmospheric greenhouse gases with detailed measurements of leaks on both sides of the meter. We don't really do that in Massachusetts. We take a guess at what's in the atmosphere. Blending hydrogen makes emissions worse, not better. 98% of hydrogen is currently made from fossil fuels, 95% from methane. And pretending these emissions don't exist because they happen in Louisiana and Pennsylvania does nothing to reach our actual goal of mitigating climate change. Those of you who have sat through some of the 2080 preceding meetings will have heard them insist over and over again that green hydrogen is emission-free. Or pretending that they're not going to have to use, I'm sorry, I misspoke, that they're not going to have to use steam methane reforming to meet the timeline in Massachusetts. We're going to look at blue hydrogen, which is whether carbon capture and sequestration actually works. This is based on Bob Haworth and Mark Jacobson's paper analyzing total emission from various ways to make hydrogen. This technology developed over the last 50 years, mainly for enhanced oil recovery, not for sequestering carbon. So there's no real measurements about whether the carbon actually stays underground or not. Blue hydrogen captures maybe 60% of the methane and carbon dioxide that are released. So I think I mentioned previously that steam methane reforming emits 10 tons of pollution for every ton of hydrogen created. So you're still emitting quite a bit of carbon pollution during that process. And you're also still getting the methane emissions from the pipelines to get the methane to the factory, to the refinery where it's being made. When you're piping hydrogen at a 20% blend, you have to remember you're still piping 80% methane, and that methane is going to continue to leak all along the transmission and distribution lines. Hydrogen leaks at around twice the rate of methane, and hydrogen is itself a greenhouse gas. It's an indirect greenhouse gas, so it makes the effects of methane worse than it would be if you were just leaking methane directly. So these two bars are the emissions with carbon capture. So you can see they're not too much lower than gray hydrogen. Is hydrogen safe? We know that airline pilots follow safety protocols, as do surgeons, have checklists and protocols to try to make their efforts as safe as possible. Utilities in the DPU assure us of the safety of gas. However, we don't have all the data we need to know if that's true. That's been pointed out in two analytical reports, Rolling the Dice and the State Commission Safety Report by Dynamic Risk. So gas companies don't appear to track and analyze when and where gas incidents occur. For example, we don't know if manhole cover explosions tend to happen more often on 6-inch mains or in smaller pipes. We do know from reading the paper that explosions happen with some regularity. Between May and September of last year, a block in Maynard was evacuated after an explosion. One manhole fire endangered an entire Boston neighborhood, and one house explosion caused a fatality. Maybe one death a year is an acceptable risk for 1.3 million customers, but it's something that we should be more aware of and more more analytical about. Utilities also ignore incidents that may be warning signs of larger events. For example, in December 2019, a series of manhole covers exploded one after another on a major thoroughfare. Luckily, no one was hurt, but the only record of that incident was news stories. Now we're going to talk about adding a gas to the pipelines with different and more explosive characteristics. So how does hydrogen burn? It burns hotter than methane by a couple of 100 degrees Kelvin. It has a pale blue flame, which you can't see here. It's almost invisible during daylight hours. Mercaptan is used with fossil gas to alert consumers with its stinky smell, but hydrogen requires a very light compound to disperse at the same rate as hydrogen. So far, there is not such a compound. Hydrogen explodes in concentrations between 17 and 56%, compared to methane, which explodes in a range from 4 to 15%. So hydrogen is explosive in many more situations than fossil gas. Plus, it's such a strong explosion that it causes shock waves. Hydrogen fires have very low radiant heat, so you can't see it, and you don't know that you're in the presence of a flame until you're very close to it. Hydrogen is lighter than air, so gas disperses quickly, but fires also expand upward quickly. Hydrogen is not the same as methane, particularly due to its ability to explode over a broad range of concentrations. The last thing I'll say about safety is that we need building codes, regulations, and trained personnel. A review of fire and building codes in Massachusetts shows no mention of hydrogen. There may be regulation in the federal code, but a review of OSHA rules did not turn up any mention of hydrogen. A Newton firefighter and the Mass Firefighters Academy both said there's no hydrogen protocol and that the utilities have not reached out to them. I did find some environmental health and safety departments at local universities that cover gas fires generally, but not hydrogen specifically. So there's a first responder gap. It's true that professionals handle hydrogen in fertilizer factories and oil refineries, but think about having this substance in your home. If there's a fire or incidents, there's no one to address it. We'll look at equity just briefly. Aladine Joroff at Harvard Law School has produced a framework for understanding energy justice that takes into account the complexity of energy regulations. So the energy burden, that's the heat or eat dilemma. And the way she might apply that in this situation is that low-income customers already pay more for energy because their houses need more weatherization and air sealing. they may still have knob and tube wiring and be unable to take advantage of mass save programs. Raising the price of a fuel they're using by so much penalizes these customers further. The disproportionate distribution of the costs are negative impacts. So we probably all know about the Weymouth compressor and how that was situated in an environmental justice neighborhood that already bore a disproportionate share of industrial infrastructure. So once we place these huge compressors for methane, hydrogen, and RNG, we'll need blending machines along the pipeline. So the equity issue here is citing all this additional infrastructure. Identifying the real benefits and making sure those are distributed evenly. So the real benefit here is cleanliness and lower operating costs of electrification. So customers who can make decisions about their homes and can afford it will electrify, leaving those who can't behind. So the equitable step would be to make sure all ratepayers have the opportunity to choose the real benefit. And then fuel protected from price fluctuations. Normally commissioners would choose the lowest cost fuel, but in this situation, they might consider an approach to look for a system that flattens load curves and avoids peak pricing, making energy costs more predictable and sustainable. So quickly, we'll look at public health. All of you know that the climate change is a health emergency and that it's exacerbating the public health impacts you see listed on the left. When we add RNG and fossil hydrogen and perpetuate the gas system, we're continuing to make the climate crisis worse. Burning fossil gas creates a gas called NOx, which has a lot of negative health impacts, including inflammation of the airways, coughing and wheezing, reduced lung function, and asthma attacks. Here's the kicker. European studies have found that burning a hydrogen-enriched natural gas in an industrial setting can lead to NOx emissions up to 6 times that of methane alone. So the total cost of all air pollutants from all sources is $820 billion a year and 350,000 early deaths in the US. Utilities ask us to pay for these costs. Increasing the amount of NOx by using hydrogen is going to increase these expenses and fatalities. And of course, it has a worse impact on racial and ethnic groups that already are exposed to greater levels of air pollution. Medicare enrollment correlates with poor air quality and asthma. Hydrogen also forms particulates on combustion, which is another risk of early death and asthma and other poor health outcomes. Asthma hospitalization rates are higher in low income and communities of color, and there are persistent racial disparities in emergency department utilization for asthma. So these are all impacts that already fall on penalized groups. Adding hydrogen as another pollutant increases inequity and injustice. I'm going to turn the presentation over to Kathy now so she can tell us about policy developments in this area. Kathy?
All right. Yes. How are you? Hey, so I have 2 slides. One is policy at the state level and the other is what we're seeing at the federal level. So here at the State House, Rep. Golden, previously the chair of the telecom, utilities and energy that we heard about earlier from Leah, he did file 2 bills that are somewhat associated with hydrogen. One was to conduct a study for market deployment of RNG and low carbon fuels to reduce emissions associated with the supply of natural gas for heating. And the other 4081, somewhat believed to perhaps be a national grid bill or come from a lobby through National Grid because they spoke at the hearing in favor of the bill, was a way to get some either RECs, renewable energy credits, or ratepayer or taxpayer subsidies to incentivize hydrogen and RNG for the Commonwealth. At the same time, we saw UMass Lowell have a study funded by AIM, Associated Industries of Massachusetts, to study the use of hydrogen for low carbon heating fuel. That report has actually just been released January, entitled The Viability of Implementing Hydrogen. It recommends hydrogen for the building sector. You know, they're recommending pilots to get some good study information. They recommend accelerating the GSEP program for H2 compatible pipes. They do the same thing with, they're calling them thermal RECs. So hydrogen qualifying for RECs in the RPS. I have to read the sentence that was in the study here on that restricting electrification. It says, quote, "The authors believe that the Massachusetts electrification efforts for commercial and residential heating and cooling, that is heat pumps, should initially be implemented in locations that currently rely solely on the dirtier fossil fuels, for example, coal or oil, and do not have access to the natural gas infrastructure," end quote. So it's sort of, they're really setting it up to keep the pipeline system entrenched and running for decades to come, which I don't think is in the Commonwealth's best interest. Over at the Executive Office of Energy and Environmental Affairs at EEA, we're all pretty familiar with the 2080, which is competing with our presentation today. You know, they have a strong reliance on decarbonized gas in all of the pathway scenarios that have been put forward. I think probably all of you are aware that the DOER is ignoring the net zero stretch code requirement that came out of the Next Gen bill. And meanwhile, EEA is sort of plodding along with their 2025-2030 CECP, the Clean Energy and Climate Plan, and Mr. Baker's newly minted Clean Heat Commission. We'll have to see what comes out of that. It's being somewhat sworn to secrecy who's on it. I mean, that has come out now, but I don't think there's not a lot of transparency around it. Next slide, please. On the federal level, we are certainly seeing billions upon billions of federal dollars going into the promotion of hydrogen. The bipartisan infrastructure bill, now law, put forward $1.5 billion for electrolyzer programs, getting them more efficient and whatnot. $8 billion for 4 regional hubs to develop what they now call clean hydrogen, and $12 billion towards carbon capture and sequestration, which is of course required to come up with clean hydrogen. I would mention that in the $8 billion for those 4 regional clean hydrogen hubs, 2 of them are required to come from US regions with the greatest natural gas resources. 1 hub must demonstrate production from fossil fuels, 1 from renewable power, and 1 must use nuclear power. But since 2 of them have to come from fracked gas regions, you can imagine that 2 of them will be demonstrating hydrogen from steam methane reforming. Humorously, the bill lists coal as a possible source of that, and the end uses have to include power generation, transportation, heating, and industrial. So if you remember that slide that Sarah showed with the ladder, they're just going for the whole ladder, not the areas where electrification is not the best choice. Currently, very interesting, last week, the New Mexico governor, in her state of the state or whatever they do, she announced that they would be vying for one of those fossil fuel based hubs. And Friday, the House committee out there tabled her bill with bipartisan rejection, which is pretty interesting. New York's governor has announced that they will be vying for that renewable energy based hub. So we'll have to see how that's going. And over at the Department of Energy, they are implementing everything that came out of the bipartisan bill. So you may have heard their hydrogen earthshot, similar to the moonshot. So they're trying to get hydrogen down to $1 for each kilogram and get that done within 1 decade. But the interesting thing for us all to realize is it's of clean hydrogen. They've moving away from what Sarah was talking about, the blue, green, gray, pink, turquoise, all of the colors, and they're just going to call it clean. They are working with the EPA to define what clean is. Initially in the bipartisan infrastructure bill, it was 2 kilograms of carbon dioxide for each kilogram of hydrogen produced. The very sad thing about that is it is produced at the site, which means that no upstream or downstream emissions, like from the actual fracking transportation of the gas to the site or the hydrogen off the site, will be included in the emissions of that definition of clean hydrogen. So that's really pretty sad. Sort of how we count emissions here in Massachusetts. But also they have something they're now calling the H2 matchmaker, which is trying to match up hydrogen producers with hydrogen users to facilitate its acceptance across the country. And that's sort of the policy that we're seeing on both the state and the federal level. I think, Sarah, if you don't mind, I would like to recommend to this group that they look at what National Grid has put forward in Massachusetts already for hydrogen, right? They have a hydrogen vision, which they're running in Long Island. And they already did file a hydrogen pilot with their last rate case. The DPU booted it out of the rate case, but you should read up on that before your March meeting with them. And Judith Judson, who was our DOER commissioner, but is now the VP of US strategy at National Grid. She recently spoke at one of the ROB webinars about her vision for hydrogen in the Commonwealth. I'm happy to send that information, all of links to all of that to Lise or whoever, but y'all should read up on that before National Grid comes before you in March. Thank you.
Sure. Thanks, Kathy. I just want to close this out quickly and just say that, you know, you've had a chance to consider hydrogen and RNG across the values the DPU should be considering it from, and hopefully come to some conclusions. And it's not all bad. There's tremendous propulsion behind this hydrogen and RNG theory, but we also within our state have choices, and we can make we can make something out of the DPU proceeding. We can pass legislation. There's hope. So I'm looking forward to a discussion and hearing your questions. I'll stop sharing. And
so Sarah, there
one question.
Yeah, there's
Oh,
a question in the chat.
okay.
Judith Black is asking, isn't both hydrogen and renewable natural gas, don't they both reflect the energy company's desire to maintain the centralized and thus capitalized energy production system, I think?
Sure. That's one of my favorite lines, is that hydrogen and RNG aren't any kind of climate or technical or scientific solution. It's a business solution for the gas LDCs to stay in business and for the big transmission companies. I mean, the more you look at it, it just makes no sense. So,
right. I think, yeah, I would say it's part of their distract, delay, and derail strategy. The more we look at the shiny object of hydrogen, the more we can be distracted from the electrification that needs to go on. Same with spending money on it. We should be spending money on electrifying.
Mark Sandine asks what the EPA definition of clean hydrogen in kilograms for CO2 per kilograms of hydrogen. So I don't know that this is an EPA regulation yet, but in the legislation, it was 2 kilograms of CO2 per kilogram of hydrogen. And we know from steam methane reforming that it typically makes between 9 and 11 kilograms per kilogram of hydrogen. So somewhere they're capturing, 8 or 9 kilograms of that CO2. And that's without counting the methane emissions in the process.
Right. And part of the Earthshot work is for the Department of Energy and the EPA to come together and make that new definition. So I think that is due in May 2022.
So I have a question myself, if I may. I'm just wondering, so one of my key takeaways from this is that this blending of hydrogen or piping of hydrogen isn't going to really help the leak problem, first of all. And in fact, in some ways, it makes it worse from the sounds of it. So I just wonder if you could talk a little bit about, what the blending of hydrogen, what impact the blending of hydrogen has on the reason for being for this group, which is trying to address gas leaks.
So I'll take this, Kathy. Feel free to jump in. There haven't been really good, honest studies about leaks with hydrogen and RNG. The best data, I think, comes out of Germany from Fraunhofer. And so hydrogen is the smallest molecule, so it leaks out of tinier cracks. So Fraunhofer uses a leak rate of twice whatever the methane is leaking at. So if you have 4% methane leakage, you're going to get 8% hydrogen. The other thing is that even if you sleeve a pipe to fix leaks, the hydrogen is so small it can travel around the sleeve and get out. One of my nightmare scenarios is biking down the street into a hydrogen leak that's caught on fire, and you can't see it, and you don't feel the heat until you're in it. So I don't want to leave you with that image, so we have to have another question.
Pick a better one, yeah.
Yeah, Kathy, do you have anything to add about the leak
Well,
situation?
it's hard to come up with a rosy ending for, but I did do one of those PHMSA calls, the pipeline hazardous safety material folks, and that's where they were talking about the hydrogen being so small it escapes whatever they try to do to fix the leaks. So that is kind of exponentially making the leak problem worse.
So another thing that alarmed me about the safety issues was the fact that there's no training for first responders for dealing with hydrogen in particular. And I know that hydrogen is being used in some parts of Europe. Is there training over there? Like, do you have any information to share about the whole training issue?
So that's I haven't looked into training in Europe. They have a different system. Their distribution system is, in speaking broadly, in better shape than ours, and they never stopped certifying their appliances and systems for use with a variety of gases. So with town gas, you had to certify for hydrogen, propane, ethane, and methane, and so they continued that to the present day. Whereas now, if you have a pilot light in your stove, and you look at some of the issues that can happen with the volatility of hydrogen, that's not a safe situation. And so we need better training, but I will look into that and try to get back to you about what's going on in Europe with training.
There was just a question in the chat. So what benefit is being promoted as the reason to mix in hydrogen? And I responded that, that it is somewhat less CO2 emissions, but I'm not sure that in your new spin of the presentation, Sarah, you included the part about where hydrogen, if you have a 20% blend of hydrogen in your gas, you only reduce the emissions by 7% because it's only 30% efficient, which is a whole bunch of numbers. But even if you say, 80% fracked gas plus 20% hydrogen, is a 20% cut. It isn't, it's only a 7% cut in emissions. So after 20%, we'll have to be replacing pipelines, and we'll have to be replacing the gate station meters, like you said, and either retrofitting or replacing all of the appliances in the home. There's so much coming down for a little tiny short-term gain of a few less emissions.
Yeah, and you're absolutely right, Kathy. And that equation is just based on energy densities. And I wonder what it would be when you factor in the higher pressure that you have to send the gas through the pipes in. So it's going to leak faster because it's coming through at a higher pressure. So in real life, I don't know if it cuts emissions or at all.
Yeah.
Need somebody to do the math on that.
Are there any other questions, especially from municipalities, people who are officials or work in municipalities about this presentation and about how it might impact your work? There's one more comment from Mark Sandine, who's a Lexington Select Board member. If clean hydrogen is 2 kilograms of CO2 per kilogram of hydrogen, then it will have 1.8 kilograms therms. I can't understand this. Compare that to 5.3 kilograms therms of natural gas. So it's far from clean.
Mark, do you want to just unmute and explain that to us who aren't struggle to follow your numbers sometimes?
Sure. Basically, it's only reducing it's 1/3 of what natural gas is. So instead of 0,
Right.
which is what clean should be, it's 1/3. So you're creating quite a bit of CO2 emissions with clean. It's not even close to clean, is basically what I'm trying to say.
Right.
That's why we keep it in quotes. I think it follows the Clean Air and Clean Water Acts perfectly.
Yes,
Mhm.
one question that I had is someone who's really learning about this issue for the first time in this presentation and really getting up to speed. In addition to reading through the piece from National Grid that you mentioned, what else would you recommend to sort of really get a handle? What did you find helpful as sort of a grounding in what this might mean for communities? And in addition to going back to your presentation, which was incredibly helpful, can't believe you've learned all this in a year. Just how to stay on top of this issue and what it might mean for communities and how it's already impacting communities in other parts of the country that we might want to be aware of out here.
Yeah. Well, so far, most of the articles are either academic studies or government studies, or they're opinion pieces. I mean, I try to follow the Hydrogen Science Coalition, but those guys are highly opinionated and they're not responsible for a whole town. I think we have I don't envy municipal officials trying to meet these goals by 2030, knowing the tremendous investment and disruption they're going to cause for real people. So it's not an easy problem to solve. And it's, people object to having to replace their stove so that they're safe using hydrogen, but you're going to have to get an induction stove if you electrify, or the problem of trying to put a heat pump in a home with radiators. These are big problems that I'm not sure, how to solve or how to scale doing those efficiently and effectively as fast as we need to do them. So I would love to learn from some municipal officials, but it's a really good question, Leah. It's completely on target.
So
Should have done the science degree.
If I could give it a shot here, I think about it pretty simply. And Sarah's done a fabulous job presenting this, but when you start to think about it, if you add up what she said, It's 5 or 6 times more expensive. It's 4 times more explosive, and it doesn't really reduce emissions. So why are we even talking about it?
And it doesn't solve the gas leak problem, and we still have to replace the entire pipe distribution system in order to make it happen.
Right.
So it is, it'll be really interesting to hear what National Grid has to say about it. I'm really looking forward to that. And just put a little reminder in the chat about March 2nd, 12 o'clock, right, Anne?
Yes.
And we'll be sending out a registration link for that. Any other last minute thoughts, questions?
Do presenters get to attend the next meeting?
Absolutely. Anybody gets to attend the next meeting.
Well,
Yeah,
I mean, I think we're both happy to attend and help you decode some of the things they might say.
Of course.
I mean,
that would be
I've
good.
already heard Judith Judson and her vision for National Grid and looking for something similar to Long Island off the coast of Massachusetts, to create a hydrogen hub there. So, but I will send all of that to you, Lise, so you can share as you like.
Awesome, thank you. And I think what this is all done, what this presentation has done for us all is give us sort of a healthy skepticism going into that conversation with National Grid, and but you are more than welcome to come and provide more healthy skepticism for what they have to say.
Well, and it's interesting that by the time we meet, the business plans should be released publicly. I don't know if we'll have them analyzed by the 2nd, if they come out on the 1st, but
First.
I mean, I just want to call to people's attention that 2080 process has just been, it hasn't been involving municipalities almost at all. And I think there have been a few voices saying, hey, what about us? And but it really hasn't included municipal officials as stakeholders, and we'd love to see that change.
So Pat is asking for the best source to read up on National Grid and hydrogen now. Pat,
So I will send that. Yeah,
Okay.
I'll send that to you, Lise, and you can share it with your group.
Will do. All right.
Another thing to think about, Sarah did an excellent part of this presentation by showing how many wind turbines and that sort of thing. I like to think about it in terms of how much new renewable you'd have to produce compared to our existing electrical grid output. And you'd have to switch all of our natural gas to hydrogen. You'd have to increase our current electrical grid 6x, 6 times.
Oh.
So we've been talking about how in the world are we going to go from 5 or 10 or 15% renewable to 100%, and everybody's wringing their hands about that. So how would we do going from 20% to 100% versus 20% to 600%? So there's just massive amounts. And because you can't transport hydrogen, you have to do it locally. So you're going to have these massive electrolyzer plants all sprinkled all around Massachusetts. It's not going to be somewhere else. It's going to be in your backyard, these electrolyzer plants.
On that happy note.
Thank you, Mark, for being the last unhappy note, not us.
I just want to thank everyone for joining us today, and we will definitely send out a recording and more resources as promised. So, and we will see you March 2nd.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Sarah and Kathy.